There's a moment most men don't talk about. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't come with a warning. It comes quietly, sometime after 40, when you're sitting somewhere ordinary. Maybe at a dinner table. Maybe in your car, in a parking lot after work. Maybe in a room full of people who are laughing, and you realize you are somewhere else entirely. And the thought that arrives, the one you push away almost as fast as it comes, is this. Is this it? Not said in anger, not said in despair. Just said. Flatly, honestly, like a man reading the last page of a book he didn't know was almost finished. If you felt that, even once, this video is for you. Because what I want to tell you today is something the Stoics understood, 2,000 years before modern psychology caught up. That moment isn't the end of something. It is, if you're willing to look at it clearly, the beginning of everything that actually matters. Most men, after 40, shrink. They take up less space. They lower their expectations. They stop wanting things. They trade ambition for comfort, passion for routine, and aliveness for the appearance of stability. The Stoics did the exact opposite. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus. These were men who, precisely because of age and pressure and the weight of life, expanded. Today, I'm going to show you how they did it, and more importantly, how you can too. Let's start with something honest. There is a kind of invisibility that comes for men in midlife. It isn't the invisibility of failure. Most of the men I'm describing aren't failures. They've done what was asked of them. They've built things, raised children, held jobs, kept commitments. But somewhere between 40 and 50, the culture stops looking at them. The world that once wanted their energy now wants something younger. The relationships that once depended on their strength now feel routine. The ambitions that once lit them up have grown quiet. Not extinguished, just muffled. And many men, rather than confronting this, do something subtle and devastating. They agree with it. They accept the invisibility as verdict. They begin to walk smaller, to want less, to say I'm fine, when they mean something far more complicated. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they disappear. Not physically. They're still at the table, still paying the bills, still showing up. But something essential, some pilot light of selfhood, has been turned very, very low. The Stoics had a name for this, though they didn't use those exact words. Seneca called it living as though already dead. He watched it happen to men around him constantly. Men who had success, status, comfort, and who had, in the midst of all of it, stopped actually living. He wrote in one of his letters to his friend Lucilius, "It is not that I am brave, it is that I know what is worth fearing. And a wasted life, that is worth fearing. Growing old without having truly lived, that is worth fearing. Losing years not to illness or misfortune, but to distraction and habit, that is the real loss." Notice what he said. Not poverty, not failure, not death. A wasted life. The Stoics were obsessed with one question that most men in midlife have forgotten to ask. Am I actually living, or am I merely passing through? And the reason this question matters so much right now, at 40, at 45, at 50, is because of something the Stoics understood with brutal clarity. Time is not neutral. It is moving in one direction. And most men don't feel that urgency until it's almost too late. Before we talk about what the Stoics did, we need to understand what they diagnosed, because the Stoics weren't just philosophers sitting in ivory towers. They were men, embedded in real life. Difficult life. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. He led armies. He managed a crumbling empire during plague and war. He dealt with betrayal inside his own household. He buried children. And yet he wrote, privately, every morning, in a journal he never intended anyone to read. The book we now call the Meditations. With a clarity and discipline that has outlasted every empire he governed. Seneca was a wealthy advisor to Nero, one of history's most dangerous and unpredictable rulers. He lived constantly, with the possibility of execution. He knew that any morning could be his last. Epictetus was born a slave. Not metaphorically, literally. He was owned by another man who once broke his leg simply to demonstrate power. These men knew what pressure was. They knew what loss was. They knew what it meant. To face a world that did not care about their comfort. And what they diagnosed, what they kept returning to, in different words and different centuries, was this. Most human suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from what we tell ourselves about what happens to us. Now, before you dismiss that as simple self-help advice, let me show you what the Stoics actually meant. Because they weren't saying, just think positive thoughts. They were saying something far harder. They were saying, the story you are telling yourself about your life, right now, is almost certainly wrong. And until you examine it, you will remain trapped inside it. Let me give you the specific story most men over 40 are telling themselves. It goes something like this. I've missed my window. The best years are behind me. I'm too old to change, too set in my ways, too tired to start over. The things I wanted, I should have wanted them earlier. Now it's too late. That story feels like wisdom. It feels like realism. It feels like a man who has finally grown up and accepted the truth. The Stoics would tell you, it is none of those things. It is a story. Full stop. And it is a story that is costing you everything. Marcus Aurelius wrote, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The man who feels invisible at 45 is not receiving a verdict from the universe. He is receiving an invitation. The question is whether he is willing to read it as one. Visual 08, ancient stone path leading toward morning light. Flow/nano banana 2 prompt. Photograph a narrow ancient stone path stretching forward between weathered stone, walls or through old woodland toward a point of warm light in the far distance. The path is worn, uneven, and real imperfect stones fitted together over centuries. In the foreground, the path is in cool shadow. Moving forward along the path, the light gradually increases until the far end opens into warm golden morning light. No people are present. Captured with a wide 24 mm lens at low level, nearly ground height, creating strong perspective leading lines that draw the eye powerfully toward the lit opening in the distance. Color palette, cool gray-brown stone in the near foreground, warm amber gold opening in the far distance. Mood, an invitation to move forward, deliberate, unhurried, available. Cinematic landscape photography. Horizontal 16:9 format. So what exactly did the Stoics do, practically, not philosophically, to expand when everything around them seemed designed to make them shrink? There were 3 core moves, and I want to walk through each one in detail. The first thing the Stoics did was something most men are deeply uncomfortable with. They looked. not away, not at the horizon, not at the past or the future. They looked directly at their current life, with as little sentiment as possible, and they asked, Dakoko, Dakoko, what is actually true here? Seneca called this the evening examination. Every night before sleep, he would review his day. Not to celebrate, not to punish, but to see. He wrote, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. This is different from guilt. This is different from regret. This is the practice of a man who has decided that self-awareness is more valuable than self-comfort. For the man in midlife who feels stuck, the radical audit begins with one question. What are you tolerating that you should not be tolerating? Not in the world, in yourself. What habits have you allowed to harden into identity? What have you stopped wanting? Because it was easier to stop wanting than to keep trying and keep failing. What version of yourself did you quietly retire, without a funeral, without even an announcement, somewhere in the last decade? Most men, when they sit with these questions honestly, find something surprising. They don't find emptiness. They find something buried. Something that hasn't gone away. It has only gone quiet. The audit isn't comfortable, but it is, the Stoics would tell you, the only honest starting point. The second move the Stoics made was one of the most radical acts a man can perform. They decided who they were going to be, and then they became it. Not gradually. Not when conditions were right. Now. Epictetus, despite being a slave with a broken leg and no freedom in the external sense, built an internal identity so solid, so clear, so deliberately constructed that no one could take it from him. He wrote, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." But here is what people misread in Epictetus. They hear that and think, accept everything. Want nothing. Be passive. That is precisely backwards. Epictetus was the most internally active person imaginable. He spent every single day deliberately constructing his character, his values, his responses, his identity. What he was passive about was external results. What he was ferociously active about was internal quality. This is the move most men in midlife have stopped making. They've outsourced their identity to their job, their role, their relationships, their bank account. And when any one of those things shifts, as everything shifts eventually, they feel themselves dissolving. Because the thing they built their sense of self on has changed. The Stoic move is to build identity on something that cannot be taken. Not your title, your values, not your productivity, your character, not what you produce, who you are when you produce nothing. So here is the practical question the Stoics would ask you. Nato, who are you when everything is stripped away? Not what do you do, not what have you achieved. Who are you? If you don't have a clear answer, and most men don't, then the work isn't to fix your circumstances. The work is to build an answer worth living from. The third move the Stoics made is the one that will sound strangest to modern ears. They deliberately made their lives harder. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, would periodically dress in rough clothing, eat the simplest food, and live as though he had nothing. He called this premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of hardship. He wrote, "Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare. Do this, and you will say to yourself, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" He wasn't practicing poverty. He was practicing freedom. Because when you have voluntarily experienced the thing you fear, when you have sat with discomfort and found that you survived it, it loses its power over you. The third move the Stoics made is the one that will sound strangest to modern ears. They deliberately made their lives harder. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, would periodically dress in rough clothing, eat the simplest food, and live as though he had nothing. He called this premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of hardship. He wrote, "Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare. Do this, and you will say to yourself, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" He wasn't practicing poverty. He was practicing freedom. Because when you have voluntarily experienced the thing you fear, when you have sat with discomfort and found that you survived it, it loses its power over you. Here is something the Stoics believed that almost no modern culture reinforces. The second half of a man's life is not a descent. It is, if he is willing to do the work, an ascent. Not in the way youth is an ascent, with energy and novelty and the feeling that everything is possible, because nothing has been tried yet. But in a deeper way, the ascent of a man who has lived long enough to know what actually matters, who has been humbled enough to stop pretending, who has lost enough to know what he cannot afford to lose, who has, finally, the wisdom to live with intention rather than reaction. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, and remember, he wrote this during plague, during war, during immense personal loss. "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." He wrote that as emperor, as a man in his 40s carrying the weight of an empire. He wrote it as a reminder to himself, not to posterity. This man, surrounded by every comfort, every power, every privilege the ancient world could offer, had to remind himself to live. Because even at the top, the pull toward shrinking is real. The pull toward safety, toward repetition, toward choosing the familiar over the true. And what the Stoics offer the man in midlife is not a motivational speech. It is something harder and more useful, a clear-eyed, unflinching framework for deciding who you are going to be in the time you have left. Not wishing things were different, not waiting for permission, not looking for conditions to improve, but beginning today with what you have, as you are, to live like a man who has decided that his remaining years will not be lived in retreat. Seneca wrote, near the end of his own life, a line that every man over 40 needs to carry with him. While we wait for life, life passes. That line is not a rebuke, it is a rescue. It is Seneca reaching through 2,000 years of time and putting his hand on your shoulder and saying, "Stop waiting. You have everything you need to begin. Right now. Today." I want to close with something simple. You felt something when this video started. That feeling in a parking lot. That thought at a dinner table. That quiet, almost unspeakable question. Is this it? I want to tell you what the Stoics would say to that question. They would say, no. Not because life gets easier. It often doesn't. Not because circumstances improve. They may not, but because the man who asks that question honestly, who doesn't look away from it, who doesn't numb it or defer it, that man is still alive, in the most important sense. He is still reaching. And a man who is still reaching has not shrunk. He has only, perhaps, paused. The Stoics didn't become the men history remembers because they were given easy lives. They became those men because, in the middle of hard lives, they chose every single day as an act of will to expand, to do the audit, to build their identity on something unshakable, to walk voluntarily into difficulty rather than away from it, and most of all, to refuse to agree with the world's assessment that their time for living was behind them. Your time for living is not behind you, but it is moving. And the Stoics would tell you, with love and with urgency, and with the kind of calm authority that 2,000 years of being right tends to produce. Begin. If this reached something in you, share it with one man who needs to hear it. Not 10, just one. And if you want to go deeper into the Stoic path, for men in this season of life, subscribe, because this is only the beginning.